For 15 years, nobody questioned why the volunteer firefighter knew every building's layout by heart, why he could move through smoke like a ghost, why he always positioned the fire truck for tactical advantage. The armed gang was about to find out why. Welcome to True Human Tales. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden courage and small-town heroism, tell me in the comments from which city are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us honor the silent guardians in our communities. Millfield, Montana sat in a valley between rolling hills like something from a Norman Rockwell painting. Population 847, the town consisted of Main Street lined with family businesses, a few residential neighborhoods where everyone knew their neighbors, and farmland that stretched to the horizon. It was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked and children rode bikes until the streetlights came on. The Millfield Volunteer Fire Department operated out of a single-bay firehouse that had served the community since 1962. With a budget that barely covered equipment maintenance and fuel, the department relied entirely on local volunteers who responded to calls while juggling day jobs, families, and the dozen other responsibilities that came with small-town life. For 15 years, Jake Morrison had been the department's most reliable volunteer. At 48, he worked days as a construction foreman and spent his evenings and weekends on call for the fire department. He lived alone in a modest house 3 blocks from the firehouse, drove a well-maintained pickup truck, and had never missed an emergency call in his entire tenure as a volunteer. Most of the townspeople knew Jake as a quiet man who did his job without fanfare. He'd show up to barn fires at 2 a.m., help elderly residents replace smoke detector batteries, and spend Saturdays teaching fire safety to kids at the elementary school. During the annual Volunteer Appreciation Dinner, Jake would sit in the back, accept his service awards with a brief nod, and slip out before the speeches started. "Jake's the backbone of this department," said Chief Tom Patterson, a retired insurance adjuster who'd been running the volunteer fire service for 8 years. 15 years, never complained, never asked for special treatment. Guy knows this town better than GPS. Better than that, added Sarah Mitchell, the department's only female volunteer and a local EMT. "I swear Jake can read a building like a book, knows where every door is, every weak spot, every way in and out. Saved my life twice when structures were ready to collapse." But there were things about Jake Morrison that didn't quite add up if you knew what to look for. He approached every fire scene with tactical precision, always positioning himself and his equipment for maximum effectiveness while maintaining clear escape routes. His gear was organized with military discipline, every tool positioned for instant access in high-stress situations. And he had an unusual habit of studying building blueprints and emergency access plans with the intensity of someone trained to think strategically about urban environments. The local sheriff's department had noticed Jake's competence during the few serious incidents the town had experienced. When a propane explosion had threatened to level 3 downtown buildings, Jake had coordinated the evacuation with the calm professionalism of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions. During a flood that had trapped a family in their basement, Jake had reached them through a route that fire science manuals said was impossible. Most telling of all, Jake had an unusual relationship with emergency response protocols. He understood incident command structures, could predict how emergencies would develop, and had an uncanny ability to spot potential disasters before they materialized. During the county's emergency preparedness exercises, Jake's suggestions had impressed state officials who worked with professional departments in major cities. "Guy thinks like a tactical commander," muttered Deputy Sheriff Mike Roberts, a former Marine who'd worked with Jake during several incidents. "Sometimes I think he'd make a better crisis manager than anyone I served with." What Mike didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Jake Morrison had spent 12 years in the Marines, including 8 years as a Force Reconnaissance Marine specializing in urban warfare and building assault operations. He'd been part of teams that conducted facility seizures, structural assessments, and close-quarters combat in environments where knowing a building's layout could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Jake's specialty had been urban tactical operations and emergency response coordination. He'd spent years learning to read buildings like maps, understanding how structures failed under stress, and developing the ability to move through damaged or hostile environments where normal entry points were compromised or defended. His final deployment had been to Fallujah, where he'd spent 14 months conducting operations in an urban environment where every building could be a fortress and every room could be a trap. Jake's team had been responsible for clearing structures that insurgents had turned into weapons, using techniques that required equal parts courage, technical knowledge, and tactical precision. That deployment had ended with an operation that still haunted Jake's dreams. A school had been rigged with explosives, with 37 children trapped inside, while insurgents used the building as a defensive position. Jake's team had developed a plan to extract the children while neutralizing the threats, but the cost had been higher than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Jake had left the Marines in 2008 with an honorable discharge, a chest full of medals he'd never displayed, and skills that translated perfectly to emergency response work. The volunteer firefighter position had been ideal. It allowed him to use his tactical and structural knowledge in a peaceful environment while serving the kind of small community he'd been fighting to protect overseas. For 15 years, he'd found peace in the rhythm of emergency response, treating each call like a mission that required careful planning and flawless execution. His town was his area of responsibility, and he protected it with the same quiet professionalism he'd once brought to military operations. But on a Saturday morning in September, Jake's two worlds collided in the most violent way possible. It was 10:23 a.m. when they arrived. Jake was conducting routine equipment maintenance at the firehouse when he heard the sound that made his blood run cold, the distinctive rumble of multiple vehicles moving in tactical formation through the town's quiet streets. He stepped outside and watched as 3 black SUVs with tinted windows took positions at strategic points around Millfield's small downtown area. One parked near the bank, one positioned itself at the intersection that controlled access to the residential areas, and the third stopped directly in front of the sheriff's office. Professional, coordinated, armed. Jake's mind shifted into a mode he thought he'd left behind 15 years ago. Threat assessment, tactical options, civilian protection. The quiet volunteer firefighter was disappearing, replaced by the Force Recon Marine who'd once liberated occupied buildings in some of the world's most dangerous cities. He slipped back into the firehouse and activated the emergency radio system, but before he could call for backup, he heard gunshots from the direction of Main Street. Then, screaming. Then, an ominous silence that told him everything he needed to know about what was happening to his town. Jake moved to the firehouse's observation window and used binoculars to assess the situation. 7 men had emerged from the vehicles, all carrying automatic weapons and wearing tactical gear. They'd taken control of the bank, the sheriff's office, and the town's main intersection, effectively cutting Millfield off from outside help. But what chilled Jake to the bone was what he saw through the bank's windows. The armed men weren't robbing the place. They were herding civilians inside, gathering hostages for reasons that had nothing to do with money. This wasn't a robbery. This was an occupation. Jake counted approximately 60 civilians visible in the immediate area, including families with children who'd been shopping on Saturday morning and elderly residents who'd been enjoying coffee at Miller's Cafe. The gunmen had effectively turned downtown Millfield into a prison, with innocent people trapped in the middle of whatever operation they'd planned. Jake reached for his radio to call the state police, then stopped. The nearest backup was 45 minutes away, assuming the call could even get through. By the time help arrived, whatever these men had planned would be finished. Time to move. Jake geared up with equipment he'd modified over the years for exactly this kind of scenario. His firefighter's protective gear wasn't just for fires. The Kevlar reinforced jacket could stop small arms fire, the breathing apparatus could provide protection from chemical agents, and his helmet contained communication equipment that would let him coordinate with any responding units. Most importantly, Jake opened the secure locker he'd installed in the firehouse equipment bay, disguised as standard emergency supplies but containing tools he'd hoped never to need again. Smoke grenades, tactical restraints, and a collection of improvised weapons crafted from firefighting equipment that had been selected for their dual-purpose potential. 7 targets, unknown additional weapons, approximately 60 hostages, complex urban environment with multiple buildings and escape routes. It was exactly the kind of urban assault scenario he'd trained for his entire military career. Jake slipped out of the firehouse through the rear bay, moving through the network of alleys and service roads that connected Millfield's buildings. 15 years of responding to emergencies had taught him every route, every entrance, every tactical advantage that could be exploited in his hometown. The first gunman never saw him coming. The man was positioned at the back entrance to the bank, using his rifle to prevent anyone from escaping while his partners controlled the front. Jake emerged from the smoke of a carefully placed emergency flare, moving with the silent efficiency that had once made him an effective Marine. A fire axe became a weapon, and the gunman was unconscious and zip-tied before he could raise an alarm. 1 down, 6 to go. But Jake's real advantage wasn't superior training, it was superior knowledge. He knew every building in Millfield like they were rooms in his own house. He understood which walls were load-bearing, which roofs could support tactical movement, and which basements connected to form underground routes between buildings. The second and third gunmen were neutralized when Jake used the town's own infrastructure against them. A carefully opened fire hydrant created enough chaos and confusion to mask his approach, while smoke from emergency flares provided concealment for rapid takedowns. The fourth gunman was posted at Miller's Cafe, where he was using his weapon to keep a dozen customers pinned behind overturned tables. Jake reached him through the building's ventilation system, a route he'd memorized during fire safety inspections, but which required Force Recon training to navigate in tactical conditions. That left 3 gunmen and approximately 40 hostages concentrated in the bank building, where the armed men had gathered their captives for whatever final phase of their operation they'd planned. Jake positioned himself across the street and observed the situation through the bank's large windows. Among the hostages, he could see faces he'd known for 15 years. Mrs. Henderson, who brought cookies to the firehouse every Christmas. Tommy Chen, whose house fire Jake had helped extinguish 3 years earlier. The Morrison family, no relation despite the shared name, who'd moved to Millfield specifically because they wanted their kids to grow up in a safe small town. These weren't just civilians to Jake. They were his neighbors, his responsibility, his mission. The final assault required everything Jake had learned in both his military service and his 15 years as a volunteer firefighter. Using smoke grenades to obscure the bank's windows, he approached through the building's roof access, a route he'd studied during fire safety inspections, but which required rappelling skills learned in urban combat training. The remaining gunmen found themselves fighting an enemy who knew the building better than they did, who could predict their movements before they made them, and who had turned a small-town bank into a tactical nightmare for anyone who didn't belong there. When the last gunman fell, Jake stood in the bank lobby surrounded by 43 safe civilians and the unconscious forms of 7 would-be terrorists. State police sirens were approaching from multiple directions, alerted by the emergency signals Jake had been broadcasting throughout the operation. The questions came immediately and relentlessly. Who was he? How had he known what to do? Where had he learned to fight like that? Jake answered them with the same quiet professionalism he'd brought to 15 years of volunteer service. Yes, he'd served in the Marines. Yes, he'd been trained for situations like urban combat. No, he didn't consider himself a hero. He'd just done what needed to be done to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. But the investigation revealed more than Jake had wanted known. Military records that had been classified for years suddenly became relevant to a federal terrorism case. His service as a Force Reconnaissance Marine, his deployments to combat zones, his specialized training in urban warfare and building assault. It all came out in the reports and witness statements. The photo in the firehouse break room, the one showing 15 years of service awards and community appreciation, suddenly took on new meaning. That quiet volunteer in the background of every department photo wasn't just Jake the firefighter. He was Staff Sergeant Morrison, decorated combat veteran, a warrior who'd spent 15 years quietly protecting a small town that had become his home. When Jake returned to the firehouse a week later, everything had changed. Townspeople who'd barely spoken to him for years now stopped to shake his hand and thank him. Fellow volunteers who'd worked alongside him for over a decade looked at him with new respect and understanding. The state fire marshal sent a delegation to meet the man who'd single-handedly liberated an occupied town. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" asked Sarah Mitchell as they stood in the firehouse bay, looking at equipment that had been used to save their entire community. Jake was quiet for a moment, watching the morning sun rise over the hills that surrounded his adopted hometown. "Some things are better left in the past," he said finally. "I came here to fight fires, not to fight wars. But you saved our whole town." "I protected my community," Jake replied simply. "Same thing I've been doing for 15 years, just more obvious this time." The Millfield Volunteer Fire Department reopened for normal operations the next day with enhanced emergency protocols and a small memorial plaque near the equipment bay where the incident had begun. It didn't mention Jake by name. He'd specifically requested that it not, but simply read, "In honor of those who stand ready to serve when their community needs them most." Jake Morrison continued responding to emergency calls, arriving promptly and maintaining the same quiet professionalism he'd always shown. But now people knew who he really was and what he'd been willing to do to keep them safe. The American flag that flew from the firehouse flagpole didn't carry his name either. But everyone who saw it knew exactly who it honored and why a small town in Montana had become a symbol of the hidden heroes who serve in our communities. Sometimes guardians wear uniforms and carry weapons. Sometimes they wear firefighters' gear and drive red trucks, watching over people who trust them to arrive when everything is going wrong. Jake Morrison had been both kinds of guardian, and in the end, that's all he'd ever wanted to be, someone who answered the call when his neighbors needed help. The town was his responsibility. The people were his family. And for 15 years, he'd never let them down. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone whose quiet service protected your community without you knowing the dangers they were prepared to face? Someone who stood ready to answer the call when everything went wrong? Share their story in the comments below. Thank you for watching True Human Tales. If this story moved you, subscribe to support the channel. We publish stories that matter. Stories that remind us that heroes don't always announce themselves, and that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who volunteer to help their neighbors. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, you never know who's standing ready to protect your community.